If someone you loved betrayed you, carved lies into your name and left you to rot, what would you do? Would you run? Would you cry? Or would you become the thing they never saw coming? This is the story of how I learned to wait. How I learned to be cold. How I made my mother pay. If you like stories of family secrets, slow burn revenge, and a payoff that leaves everyone silent, stay with me. And hey, comment if you've ever had someone you trusted betray you. Let me know below. My childhood home smells like lemon oil and old money. Not the honest kind of money I learned later. The kind that smells like lemon because the surface is always being wiped clean. When I was a little girl, I would sit on the wide steps of our porch and watch my mother, Margaret Hart, glide through the rooms like a queen inspecting territory. She had that habit of touching things as if her hand could transfer meaning. A knick-knack, a framed diploma, the ledger of donations to the foundation she'd used to build her public persona. Everything she touched seemed to gather history around it. People called her gracious, philanthropic, a pillar. They liked her because she smiled like she forgave the world for existing. My father, a gentler man with tired hands, used to laugh and call her a magician. He would say, "Margaret makes order from chaos," and he meant it as a compliment. He died 2 years before the world learned how sharp her fingers could be. I remember the day the lawyer came, the kind that smells faintly of cheap coffee and forever business hours. He had an envelope and a way of looking at me that made the room small. My mother's hand was warm in mine. "We'll handle it," she said. She didn't make a promise. She iced one. What followed felt like a movie played twice. Once for neighbors and donors, and once for me. The public service obituary. The wreath. My mother on the platform, a new widow, immaculate in black, speaking about legacy and stewardship. The cameras loved her. The cameras always loved her. Home, the ledger was missing. Dad had been the quiet number keeper of the family business. Estate management, construction contracts, neighborhood revitalization. On paper it was respectable. Off paper, on receipts and in whispered phone calls at odd hours, it was the real thing that kept us fed and elevated. After his funeral, I wanted to sit in his study, to smell his tobacco and his notebook, to read the handwriting that had always made sense. But Margaret had already changed the locks. I remember the way her eyes even then did not match the warmth of her hand. They were steel loops, eyes that catalogued risk. "Emily," she said, as if asking for permission. As if I were some grant she had to approve. "You will help me with the foundation. Your calm will carry things." I was 28 then, naive enough to think calm could save a person. Within weeks, my life began to thin. My bank accounts had small discrepancies. Odd transfers that, in the grand architecture of finances, could be explained away as clerical error. My passport came back flagged. I lost a job offer on the other side of the country because a background check uncovered something. "Some mistake," my mother told me under her breath, while at cocktail parties with her hand clasped around mine like a shield. "Things will be smoothed." Smooth was a kind word for drowning. I fought. Yelled. I recorded phone calls and I wrote emails and I sent pleadings. The company's paperwork had been rewritten in a way that placed my name on invoices, allowed my signature to appear on filings, and funneled money through shell corporations that bore my name like a mask. It looked, to an algorithm and to nervous auditors, like I had been complicit. The evidence was tidy. Margins don't quiver. They march. The thing about betrayal is that it doesn't always show itself as a shout. Sometimes it arrives as silence and a neat ledger. I learned to hate paper. When the auditors came, Margaret cried for the cameras. "We will cooperate," she said. She sat beside me at the table with the immaculate hands everyone trusted, and spoke in soft, charitable platitudes as men with clipboards shuffled papers and found my fingerprints on things I had never signed. "You must have," Detective Laura Price would later say, flipping through the stacks, her voice like someone impatient with theatrics. "You must have signed them." I had not. But had not is easy in a courtroom when a file is stamped and a signature looks like mine. The first time I thought about running, it was at 3 in the morning, with the old house breathing around me like a beast. Margaret was asleep in the master bedroom, the citrus scent of her perfume lacing the hallways. I bundled up, took the keys I found under the piano, an old trick, and drove until the city put distance between my tainted name and the lights. I had $70 in my pocket and a duffel bag and the kind of anger that makes your voice sound hollow. I took the bus to a place where no one knew either name, and in the morning I found I felt lighter for an hour. Then the phone calls came. Margaret did not call to beg. She called to place the story in the world. "Emily," she said on the line, pinning each syllable like a corset. "You know I will do what is best for the family." What she meant was I would either shape up or be shaped. I didn't go to jail then. A settlement, quiet and guiltless, sealed the first act. I lost money, reputation, and an engagement ring from a man who believed in my innocence but could not stand the shadow that followed my name. Ethan left in a manner that felt like a polite closing statement. "I love you, but I can't keep watching." I deserved to be angry at him, but I was angrier at the taste of Margaret's smile in his mouth. It takes an ugly sort of clarity to be broken in half by someone whose face you once liked to trace in photographs. The world collapses into small, surgical awakenings. I re-entered my life like a ghost, careful, precise, learning the new boundaries. Yet even ghosts have temper. I learned then that some things cannot be apologized into being undone. Prison has a way of teaching economies. Do not waste breath. Save it for when you need to name someone's sins in the sunlight. I didn't go to prison for long. Only the kind of charge that makes your neighbors avoid your face and your email returns an auto message. But I spent nights with women who had been broken in ways language tries to rescue. They taught me tactics for endurance. You keep the small things tidy, you keep your hair out of your eyes, you keep a salt packet for when you miss the taste of home. But more importantly, they taught me observation. My cellmate Mara was a librarian's daughter who could find a civil case faster than a Google engineer. She taught me that public records never die. They hide like rabbits in the underbrush, and you need patience and the right net to catch them. When I got out, she pressed a small notebook into my hands. "You have to be smarter than the liar," she said. "Smarter than the person who can buy alibis." Smarter than Margaret Hart was a high bar. She had millions in the bank, a smile that made priests forget their vows, and a foundation that let her scrub stories in glossy annual reports. But she had created what all powerful people create. A pattern. There are telling mistakes even kings make. They reuse lawyers. They lean on the same bankers. They forget minor signatures on the wrong copy. They are human in their hubris. My revenge began in the architecture of record-keeping. I started small and slow and in places that did not know my name. County clerks I could charm, or at least not alarm, with questions about zoning permits and easements. I worked as a contractor's assistant for a few months, wearing a fluorescent vest and learning to look at blueprints with a new eye. I volunteered with a small non-profit that did records digitization and learned to find missing links in scanned pages. No one asked who Emily Hart was when she came in with a cup of bad coffee and a willingness to alphabetize. Meanwhile, I started to collect. Not money. I did not trust money when it was connected to Margaret, but fragments. An old invoice with a middleman I had never heard of. A charity event photograph where a smiling donor's face matched a name on a list of shell companies. A contractor's ledger with a note in the margin. PM, payoff September 12th. The margins were where people leaked. Detective Laura Price called me the first time because she had a bad habit of not accepting the world as told. She had been assigned the audit on a hunch, and Laura's hunches were not for fashion. She was the kind of investigator who reads too much into the way people hold their coffee cups. She had gray in her hair at 39 and a dog-eared binder of subpoenas. "You're naive," she told me the first time we spoke in the back of a police cruiser while a late storm tightened the city's gutters. And you're angry. Both of those things can be useful in a fight. She told me something I already knew. The forensic accountants had found a cluster of transfers routing through non-profits and real estate deals that led directly back to the Heart Foundation's shell stitching. The problem was, and this is where Margaret's genius lay, the paper trail had been doctored to show me as the signer. Her team had found no direct evidence of coercion. They made a career out of looking clean, Laura said. They have a PR director who can make a bribe look like a scholarship. Then let's make sure the next time the world looks, it sees different paperwork, I said. I had learned to speak like someone who did not privilege sentiment over strategy. Working with Laura meant I gave myself a sanctioned path to poke the hushed places of our family's business. But the problem with sanctioned paths is that they are slow and often lack cruelty. I did not want only a civil resolution. I wanted to take things Margaret loved, her public face, her donors, her comfortable sleep, and make them fracture. I wanted to see her hands tremble once like mine had. So I cultivated patience. I learned to plant questions in places where Margaret could not notice me. I befriended the people who took her calls. Her assistant, the young PR man who wore expensive shoes and too much certainty. I listened to the cadence of her lies. She loved the idea of permanence. She loved exquisitely constructed legacies. She could not abide the idea that reputations could be brittle things, easily undone by the right question in public. There are two ways to unmask a matriarch. One is through evidence so definitive it breaks an institution. The other is to take the matriarch's audience, one person at a time, and show them that the woman they loved money more. I wanted both. I made friends with a journalist who wrote obituaries and the occasional investigative piece. He liked the quiet voice of righteous anger if it had sources. I fed him small, irrepressible crumbs. A cancelled check, a receipt, the name of a shell company that paid for a gala no one could account for. He followed, as journalists must, and found patterns. Margaret began to complain. She wrote thin, barbed emails to the foundation staff about rumors and rogue reporters. She organized a high-profile dinner and invited donors who had supported her for decades. She wanted to remind the city that she was indispensable. She wanted to surround herself with a familiar throng of people who believed the story she had purchased. It was the perfect place to make her audience see the truth. They served oysters that evening and white wine in crystal. The city's elite came glittering in fur and carefully curated compassion. The talk was of refurbishments and plaques, the things patrons of legacy like to chew over before they leave the mark that will be remembered. Margaret glided like some pale moon across the ballroom, her voice honey but thin. She greeted guests, kissed cheeks, and posed for photographs that would appear in the society pages. I sat at the edge of the ballroom in a dress that was deliberately forgettable. It was less about not being seen and more about letting the room's lights make me invisible. Ethan sat across from me, looking like a man who had been asked to be content with the smaller pieces of a shattered puzzle. He had come to the dinner reluctantly. He had always loved Margaret for the reasons children love their mothers, as a mythic tether. Took a lot to sever that. Emily! He reached out and took my hand. You don't have to do this alone. I don't want your counsel, I said, and the words were soft but complete. He disappeared a little then, like a man who had once been steady but now lacked permission to be so. At the dinner, Margaret gave a speech about community and guardianship. Her voice dropped in the right places. The crowd ate up the lines about stewardship with the hunger of people who had funded the artless comfort of their own conscience. I watched Margaret watch her audience. She loved that look. She believed in it like some people believe in prayer. Somewhere in the second course, the lights dimmed and the screen behind the stage came alive with images. There was a slideshow, the foundation's highlights. A park refurbished, a scholarship awarded, smiling children. The audience clapped and the room swelled with self-approving air. My journalist friend, Jonah, had a sense of theater. He had been subtle as I'd asked. When the slideshow hit the gulf where donors' names scrolled, a white slide followed. It was the kind of thing programs used to reset the viewer's attention. For a heartbeat, the room had nothing but the hush of someone waiting for punchline. Then the slide filled with a single scanned document. A contract. At first no one read it, but as the camera panned across and Jonah's voice, live, recorded, clinical, described the transaction, the room froze. The contract was marked with Margaret's letterhead. It was a construction management agreement with a common-sounding name. Harrow Realty Services, LLC. The contract requested emergency payment for project continuity and bore a note. Payment route, Hart Foundation pass-through, Emily Hart sign-off. There was a stamp. Payment cleared. There was a signature that looked like mine. Gasps moved like a ripple across the caviar. Some people laughed, the nervous sort of laugh that occurs in a room that has just been told the wrong thing. Margaret's smile tightened. People looked at her. People looked at the screen. People shifted in their seats as if their chairs were suddenly less comfortable than they had been 5 minutes ago. Jonah's voice was not melodramatic. He read aloud some of the entries in the file. He read the wiring details that linked the Harrow account to multiple shell companies. He read the name of a contractor with a criminal record. He read it, and when he finished, the room had grown an animal's hush, big, watchful, and hungry. Margaret stood slowly. "There must be some mistake," she said, in the same tone she'd used for my father's funeral. "These allegations are unfounded." Her hands were steady. Her voice shook once, like someone testing a borrowed scale. Jonah then did something that was gutsy and perfect. He pivoted to the biography slide where he had inserted a series of documents that traced payments back to donors who had given directly to Margaret's so-called philanthropic fund. Names of donors, people who had thought their gifts built playgrounds, appeared next to wire instructions diverted to a private holding company in the Caymans. The room stirred. A man in the front row put his hand to his throat. Police emails had been leaked to Jonah by someone anonymous. That someone had placed a subpoena request the week prior that Margaret had somehow managed to quash using an emergency injunction. The public would not see the subpoena, but they saw the payments. They saw the faces of the children next to the map of offshore accounts, and the word embezzlement floated in the air like smoke. Margaret's mask began to crack. She moved to the podium, palms out, the posture of someone who believes expression will substitute for absence of proof. "These are wild accusations," she said. "We will cooperate." Laura at the back did not move. She had the look of a surgeon waiting to see if a patient would bleed. The dinner collapsed into people whispering, standing, and flicking the tiny devices they used to post themselves onto, always watching social feeds. Within minutes, the room was warm with the sound of phones and the churning of donors seeing their names next to offshore holdings. Margaret's eyes found mine across the ballroom. For a split second she looked wounded, and I almost felt a phantom of the old love I had once reserved for her. Then the look hardened. She mouthed, "Not yet." The next morning, there were 10 emails from donors I had never met. They were polite, then sharp, then lit with suspicion. Some asked for clarifications. Some threatened to pull funding and threatened to sue. It was delicious in a small, surgical way. I wanted to watch the people who had built their sense of worth on donations discover that they had been complicit in being lied to. What I wanted even more was for Margaret to understand, on a threadbare level she couldn't buy off, that people could see her for what she was. Margaret's counter was as predictably vicious as a trained animal. She hired lawyers, issued denials, and opened up an internal audit she paid to be transparent. She had press releases written that weeks later were quoted like scripture by anchors who preferred the side with the prettier smile. She sat for interviews that would air with a sympathetic backdrop and a voice impurified by carefully chosen questions. The foundation's board, long loyal, splintered like bone. Some members stayed. Others fled like leaves. The bank that handled heart accounts quietly froze a couple of lines of credit while auditors shuffled files. The foundation's gala sponsors began dropping out with the same clinical language of reputational risk. Margaret's world reared, then wobbled, then cracked. But the public storm was only the surface. The more delicious part, the private reckoning, came slowly. Margaret trusted the wrong people because she needed them to believe that her control was unshakable. She did not notice bargains being made in corners she never bothered to visit. Ethan, the ex who had once taken refuge in my easy-given love, came back because he could not stand to watch her destroy what little was left of our family's name by sheer self-interest. He had access to accounts and to a file drawer in a town office she thought she had bought. He found things, little notes in his father's handwriting about shell entities, entries that suggested his father may have disagreed with Margaret on many payments. There was a crumpled post-it that said, "Ask Emily, she's not in it." When I first read my father's note, it felt like a benediction. The man I had loved had always left me small proofs of love like bookmarks. This was not a romantic proof. It was proof that my father had suspected and had tried to warn someone, in handwriting that favored neat letters and marginal jabs. It was an admission disguised as a reminder. Ask Emily. I began to think of my revenge less as a theatrical denouement and more as an exhumation. I wanted to dig up what had been buried. The truth, rotted and preserved, of how they built a life on other people's silence. I wanted the world to open their hands and see the bones. So I became surgical. I fed certain banks small, verifiable leads until their legal departments demanded answers. I leaked, through Jonah, an anonymous list of transactions tied to specific local projects. And donors cancelled, board meetings became hostile, and Margaret had to stand in the middle of it and explain in circles. She responded like any controlled person, with control. She moved money, rotated staff, and tried to make the scandal into a procedural misstep. She held a town hall and wept beautifully for the cameras. She said, "I have made mistakes," and people thought perhaps that she meant it. Those of us who had been broken by her knew she was naming nothing specific. Meanwhile, Detective Laura Price dug. Laura had that quality of stubborn devotion that takes time to appreciate. She pursued subpoenas and retraced transactions on a bad server. And for every step Margaret took to clean a path, Laura found a footnote. She found a lawyer who had been too casual in his oversight and a banker who had made a wire transfer at an odd hour for reasons he could not explain. But lawyers and bankers have ways. They are either paid enough to be silent or shamed enough to flee. My private network, Jonah, Ethan, Mara, and two other women who lived in the cracks of concession stands and DMV lines, were not formidable on money. We were formidable on truth, on the relentless needle of being where a person least expects to be. There was a time around the 6th month when I wished for a hammer. I wanted to throw things. I wanted violence that would banish the quietness. But violence is messy and messy betrays you. I had learned that through my time with other women who had needed clever workarounds to survive. I wanted a demolition that looked like an accident, a revelation that looked like curiosity, a betrayal that looked like someone else's conscience catching up. My favorite small victory was a petty, perfect thing. Margaret's assistant, a woman named April who had once been proud and then afraid, started to keep copies of emails in a hidden folder. April had watched Margaret's confidence swallow people and had learned to avoid the splash zone. I made her tea and listened. I told her I believed her when she said she deserved better. I promised nothing, but I listened. People reveal themselves to listeners. It is the oldest trick in social life. April handed me a folder in an empty office, her fingers trembling. It contained an email chain with Margaret's directions for a donor reconsolidation, and a line that read plainly, "Make sure the heart pass-through clears under Emily's signature. We will run this out as an administrative necessity." The language was antiseptic and monstrous. When I read that line, I did not cheer. I did not sing. I sat very still and counted the ways in which I could make that line mean something to the people who thought Margaret was their saint. The thing about a matriarch is she cannot abide being unadored. She had built a world of flattery and staged gratitude. The better the applause, the more ruthless her appetite. So I planned the largest performance of my life where it would hurt her most, in front of those who had loved her. I worked with Jonah to create a public narrative that didn't scream. Instead, it squeaked inside the gears of charity and reputation until the machine stalled. We prepared a deposit of documents at a reputable paper with a track record for exposing non-profits. We arranged for the story to drop the morning after the donor gala that Margaret was planning to assert her leadership at. We scheduled interviews not to be inflammatory but to let the evidence speak for itself. Bank transfers, emails, July contracts that matched the exact dates of trophy renovations with phantom contractor Harrow Realty. Ethan and I met in a diner late at night and reviewed the plan. "You know she'll come at us," he said, voice low and loyal in a way I had not seen since before he married the idea of being comfortable. "I know," I said. "She'll think she can buy an alibi. She'll think she can throw money at a problem and it will fade. She doesn't understand patience." "What will you do when she looks at you?" he asked, and for a brief second I felt the old warmth. "I'll look at her like someone who once loved a liar and then learned to read a ledger," I said. The morning of the release, the city woke up to headlines that tasted like winter. The paper ran the documents alongside a narrative painstakingly built on forensic accounting. The language was precise. It did not editorialize so much as allow the documents to reveal themselves in order. Donations, transfers, shell companies, payments to contractors that turned up in other jurisdictions, the Harrow Realty link, the note about Emily sign-off. Television picked up the story. Panelists chewed the crumbs. Margaret released a statement in which she called the allegations malicious and false, and said the foundation would fully cooperate. People who had once called her family wrote letters withdrawing their money and their permission for statues, and I had hoped for more immediate collapse, a single, shattering public humiliation. But Margaret's blood had been steeped in survival tactics. She hired rapid crisis counsel. She had a crisis communicator on retainer who could make indignation look like an arc of moral growth. She did something that was predictable and clever. She called for a press conference and named herself the injured party. She did not expect one thing she could not buy: a woman from the foundation's own community outreach program with a child and a small voice who stood in front of microphones and read, tearful and steady, a list of projects delayed because the funds were gone. She read names. She read grant approvals cancelled. She read a child's scholarship revoked. The microphone picked up each syllable like small, righteous stones hitting glass. In private, Margaret raged. She screamed at staff through glasses and tried to reforge alliances. She also tried money, the old faithful. Wire transfers to key board members, promises of consulting fees, extravagant dinners. For a while some people accepted. But money cannot buy a childhood scholarship once the kid has moved school and once the room that was patched because of a donor is now a gaping hole in a neighborhood that needed the repairs. Then the most delicious thing happened. Donors started asking for names. They wanted to know who had handled the funds and if an independent forensic audit had been performed. With each question, the board's confidence quivered. A small voice in that boardroom asked aloud, "Why was Emily's name on this documentation?" That small voice was fatal. At dinner that night, Margaret cornered me in the foyer, away from cameras and cameras pretending men. Her makeup had been redone to porcelain perfection, but she smelled of anger unscluted. "You started this," she said. There was no mother in her voice. Only the seasoned hunter. "I started nothing," I said. "I thought of my father and the post-it and the ledger. I thought of all the small, steady corrosion of truth that had been saved for me like a carefully wrapped blade. I started telling people what you did. You could have come to me," she said, which is how liars always try to redeploy guilt. "We could have worked this out. We are family. You used my name to funnel money through non-profit gifts," I said. My voice did not tremble. People around us moved like marionettes. You stole from people who trusted you. You used plaques and playgrounds to launder lives. She blinked, as if surprised I had read the ledger's lines. You were desperate, she said. Desperation doesn't explain murder, I said. Her face went small and then white. A tilt I had never seen before. She laughed, a thin, disbelieving thing. You're hysterical. I had always thought of hysterical as an insult men and mothers give women to dismiss their intelligence. I embraced the accusation and returned it to her like a coin. You killed him, I said. She did not answer. The room filled like a storm. It felt less like the end of a conversation and more like a curtain pulling back in a theater play we had never been allowed to rehearse. You have proof? She asked finally. I had proof more devastating than an email chain. The old notebook where my father had written names. Ethan had found it. A script of a quarrel in which love decayed into disagreement, and then a scrawl that read, "She's taken over. Be careful with Emily. Don't let her name get stained." You think this will fix anything? She asked, voice brittle. Smiled. It is a small thing how comforting it is when someone you loved looks small. No. But it will make sure you never wear your crown again. The police called it a homicide review. Called it the cleanup. When my father's death was quietly reopened, it had the efficiency of a legal machine clicking into place. The original death report had been an accident. A fall, heart failure, the sum of many small things that make people stop breathing. But death records are paper too, and paper relaxes when someone has money. This time, with the publicity and Jonah's documents, a coroner agreed to re-examine. Laura Price had the audacity to request the old footage from the night of my father's death at the hospital. The footage had been stored in a quiet corner of an administrative office, on an old server. The hospital staff had thought no one would ever search it because they assumed no one was interested in the mundane end of a man who had not been a celebrity. But detectives are curious like sea animals. And Laura was patient. The footage was grainy and unforgiving. It showed the way my mother moved through the corridors on the night in question. It showed a cluster of conversations and a familiar leaning posture. It showed a nurse who had taken a call and stood off to the side while someone else remained in the room. It showed, finally, the small detail that would become the hinge. A black coffee cup on the tray that contained a residue of a sedative that was not prescribed to my father. The toxicology report, when it was finally done and reviewed, showed traces of a drug that induced arrhythmia. The kind that, given in the right amount to an old heart, would make a fall and a misreported death look like an accident. We had built an edifice of small patient things. Bank statements, raw footage, a nurse's memory jogged by the sound of a name, Margaret Hart, on a call that night. We had an audio clip of an assistant, April, whose voice cracked while she admitted to moving paperwork at Margaret's request. We had emails, and we had a forensic accountant who could testify that transfers matched a plan. We had enough. Margaret's arrest was not cinematic. It was a quiet, clinical moment where men in plain suits took her wrist and led her away while television anchors practiced various tones of civility. She sang her quaint, genial lines for the microphones. "This is baseless. I will prove my innocence." She looked at me once as the doors closed and something like hunger flickered. I wanted to see fear, not hunger. I wanted to see a woman who had been so carefully built reveal the ruin underneath. Instead, she looked magnificent in her prison-issued hairnet, as if even handcuffs were another accessory to show off. It was a small disappointment. Power had taught her to stage everything, including disgrace. But within a week, the board resigned, donors demanded refunds, and the foundation's bank accounts were frozen. The plaques, the dedication ceremonies, and the legacy photos were all dusted and catalogued as evidence. People sent me messages. Some said thank you. Some said I had been cruel. Some said I had finally taken a mother down. The spectrum of comments was as generous and as mean as a social feed can be. There were nights when I woke up and the city felt too large for the quiet I had made. I wondered if I had, by my actions, become the person I once hated. But I had made a promise to myself that had nothing to do with righteousness. I wanted to rewrite a ledger that had stolen a childhood and that had used my name as a mask. I wanted to ensure no other child would bind their trust to a woman who worshipped money under the guise of charity. The trial was long and televised in small sections. Margaret's defense tried to attack the integrity of witnesses, to claim collusion. She tried to paint me as a vengeful daughter, a woman who had been drunk on resentment. Her lawyers argued that the presence of my name on documents was a matter of administrative convenience during a chaotic time. When I took the stand, I did not cry. I did not howl. I told the truth in the exact cadence of a ledger entry. Sharp, factual, not flamboyant. I read from my father's note and from April's email. I told the court that love can be a currency as dangerous as money, and that my mother had used both to get what she wanted. Margaret, in her cross-examination, tried to make me the villain of my own life. She asked if I had been bitter when Ethan left. She asked if I had threatened to ruin her. She asked, in a tone that betrayed nothing but practiced mortification, if revenge could be a motive for falsified documents. I smiled a small, private smile as the judge cut her off. The judge wanted evidence, not speculation. In the end, the jury returned a verdict that felt like ice in my mouth. Guilty on multiple counts, embezzlement, fraud, and, the crown of it all, conspiracy to commit manslaughter. She was sentenced. Not to the long time in the world I imagined when I was a child, where retribution would be theatrical and final, but to a number of years that would ensure she would lose the thing she valued most. Money, power, the daily ritual of being called charitable. When she stood in the dock and looked at me for the last time before she was led away, the expression in her eyes was not one of regret but of arithmetic. She had calculated the odds and banked on the wrong hand. There is a terrible dignity in a person who thinks they cannot be undone, and it was oddly beautiful to watch her discover that she could be. The storm settled like dust. People who had once loved Margaret had to decide if they had loved the woman or the idea of her. Some slowly returned to public life. Some vanished from donor roles. The foundation was liquidated and its projects taken over by smaller local non-profits who had no interest in glossy publicity. I did not go back to the city for a long time. I took a small apartment above a bakery and learned that mornings are better when you can smell bread. I took a job where no one cared about my last name. I learned to step into rooms without the weight of a family table behind me. In the mornings I walked through neighborhoods my mother had once decided to fund and looked at benches and planters and thought about the people who used them. If my revenge had been surgical, the aftermath was a slow, healing geography. The more complicated threads of my life were not so easily repaired. Ethan and I reconciled gradually. Not with the speed or fury of cinematic reunions, but with the slow accretion of trust. He did not forgive me for the secrets I had kept while we were together, for my silence in the face of doubt and for my choice to orchestrate this public ruin. But he did not leave. He sat with me in the quiet and helped me rebuild a life that would not be dominated by ledgers. My mother wrote letters from prison that arrived with terrible regularity. She would alternate between claiming innocence and offering faint condolences, as if remorse could be folded into a sheet of loose notebook paper. The lines were practiced. She asked for forgiveness. I wrote nothing in return for many months. There were nights when I missed her voice in the way one misses the sound of a hometown that has been demolished to make room for progress. There were nights when I hated her in the way a woman hates the mirror. But these feelings were mine and I kept them. They were not for public spectacle any more than they had been when she used them to buy trophies. Sometimes I went to the courthouse just to watch the slow equipment of justice. The machinery is less dramatic than it looks in films. It is a steady trudge of depositions, footnotes, and cross-examinations that build a cage out of the truth. Watching it gave me a sense of sobriety I hadn't known. That justice is rarely swift, but once assembled it is almost impossible to ignore. Detective Laura Price visited once, and we had coffee in a small diner that smelled of grease and sincerity. "You did the hard part," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "They don't teach you how to build patience in school." "You taught me how to wait," I said. She smiled. "We made a good team." "And the foundation?" I asked, because even victories have loose ends. "It's under new management," she said. "Smaller. Less glory. Probably better." Felt like a good answer. The media moved on, as media always does. For a few weeks they ran segments about the fall of a queen. For a few months people talked about the moral hazard of giving. And then, slowly, more appetizing scandals took the stage. My life returned to its ordinary geometry, which is a strange and welcome thing. In the end, revenge is not a firework. It is a set of carefully placed mirrors. It requires patience and detachment and the willingness to watch people move through the truth you have given them. Cold satisfaction is not the heat of a blow. It is the clarity at the other side of a battle that drains one of the fever. My mother is still alive. She writes sometimes and I answer rarely. Once, when the leaves were turning and the city smelled of wet pavement and the beginning of something else, I went to the prison visiting room. She had put on lipstick and the effort looked like ceremony. The woman she was then, the woman who had smoothed ribbons across problems, sat across from me with the posture of someone expecting judgment. "I did what I had to do," she said without apology. It was both a confession and a litany. "You did what you wanted," I said. "There's a difference." She reached for my hand the same way she used to, the touch of the woman who could arrange the world. "Do you hate me?" she asked. Her voice was a small human thing under a mountain of wrongdoing. "I don't feel the word hate the way you may think," I said. "Hate is a hot thing. I am colder. There is a particular crystalline relief in telling someone that you are not burning for them. My life is mine." She closed her eyes and for a second I thought I saw something like regret. For a second I had the strangest desire to tell her everything that had happened since her arrest. The small joys, Ethan's slow return, the bench in the park someone finally replaced with new wood. Instead I shook my head. "Good," she said. "Cold is better for the heart. It preserves." I left her there, behind a pane of glass and a series of numbered protocols. Outside, a woman I did not know sold flowers and the sun lay on a row of parked cars. I lit a cigarette at the corner because I had always liked the ritual, and then I put it out. I had no need for that smoke to mark the moment. The final part of revenge, I learned, is not in watching the other person fall. It is in watching yourself stand up afterward. It is in buying a cheap apartment above a bakery and learning the names of the baristas. It is in calling your father by the endearment he used to use and hearing the echo of someone who loved you imperfectly. It is in consolations that do not need to be announced. I write now because the act of telling is a form of ownership. I tell the story so that people understand that family can be a place of sanctuary or a place of theft. Can house angels or con artists. You do not always get to choose the people who hurt you, but you always get to decide what to do next. The last time I saw Margaret, she looked at me with an expression of calculation I had once admired and now feared. She had lost more than her freedom. She had lost the audience she'd built on charity and gossip. She had lost the taste of power you get from being untouchable. I had not reclaimed everything. Money had been returned to some accounts, but not to the names of all those who had been hurt. Some people found their lives altered in ways no restitution could mend. I had not been a saint. I had not wanted to be. But I had made sure the ledger no longer used my name as a mask. I had ensured that the woman who had once taught me to love legacy would have the time to reflect behind bars. The revenge was cold because I needed it to be. Precise, careful, and unambiguous. If you ask me if I feel triumphant, I will tell you this. I feel quiet and I feel right. There is a strange mercy to having your name clear of stain. There is a strange joy in discovery and in knowing the world is not necessarily fair, but that sometimes justice can be assembled like a careful code, and sometimes it works. At night, I still wake from time to time and replay the ledger, as if I can trace the lines again by heart. Those lines taught me patience and the sense to wait until the right place to strike. Blood binds people together, but blood also betrays. The only thing you can do when someone uses your blood against you is to make sure the world recognizes the crime. This is my recognition. If you've ever been betrayed by the person who was supposed to keep you safe, I hope this story gives you the patience to wait, the cunning to plan, and the cold satisfaction of righting at least part of what was taken. You deserve the truth. And sometimes you deserve to be the one to let it free.
If this story gave you chills, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever seen play out?